Okay, for this week we are on to engineers. Tacticals last week. Let's have a go at seeing how the people you're shooting at actually fare up and what they do. Now, as an engineer, what's the first thing you think of?
Shields.
Hull.
Staying alive.
Shields and hull.
Healing and tanking for me.
Supporting.
Yep, Amaro, Thorley and Shanna sit it there. General support, tanking, healing are essentially subcategories of that. But the engineers are probably they're very flexible in space. They can perform obviously great amounts of tanking and sufficient amount of healing, and they can pump out a little bit of DPS thanks to the EPS power transfer ability. Now, a few of you point out that shield tanking, shields is not necessarily the only way to tank. You can hull tank in certain ways as well by using resist like polarized hull, abilities like hazard emitters, oxysafe. Those generally seem to be the most common ones I've seen. Engineering team as well, but me personally, I wouldn't recommend using it. But that's just my personal opinion. Now, shields tend, I'm going to say this up front, shields tend to be the more effective out of the two tanking abilities of shield and hull, simply because you will have generally better resistance with shields. There are more abilities with generally better stats and better buffs with shields, and you will have more abilities to use them with. And the fact that you have a secondary resistance pocket, so to speak, under that, which of course is the hull itself. Now, there are certain abilities which you will probably use the most common. Emergency Power Shield is probably the one everybody uses at some point. And those can be handy against resisting against any type of target and any type of weapon, really. Torpedoes will be your nightmare as a whole, because basically every single weapon in the game will be able to hit you once your shields are down. Torpedoes are completely ineffective just about when your shields are up. So that gives you a barrier against a type of weapon power already, which therefore means that, well, if you can draw out a certain weapon simply by the way you tank, I'd suggest you go for it. Make it easy for yourself. That's just one area of the engineer specialize at. You have things like rotate shield frequency and other resistance abilities like Nadian inversion, which is good at tanking against power drains, and of course EPS is good at the same thing as well, and the engineering fleet, which is good at boosting your shield and, well, hull resistance, should I say. I'm getting confused with science, but those are just a couple of the abilities. Now, like I said, EPS power transfer, that will be probably one of your handy abilities. It boosts your power levels, as in all of them, and your power transfer rate. So that means you can do a bit more DPS if you've got the sort of satisfactory DPS if, say, you're in an escort, an engineer in an escort. Engineers and escorts work rather well, simply because you have the survivability that most escorts lack, although that's not as much of a thing nowadays. And like I say, you can pump out sufficient DPS as well, perhaps even on par with a tactic officer, despite lacking the alpha strike qualities of attack bat and alpha. Your weapon power will never go down if you have EPS power transfer on, and it's even more emphasized with Nadian inversion. So don't rule out other different ship classes just because you're one specific type. Now, tacticals and science will have their different aspects, which specific ship they're good at. Engineers, like I said, tend to be the more flexible out of the three professions. You can do DPS because your weapon power can never drain, despite the power only being temporary. Obviously, tanking and healing is a good thing as well, and they do have some somewhat limited science capabilities, but they are present. They can do well in science ships as well, particularly ships like the Vesta and the Nebula, because those are engineering oriented as well. So that boils down to three basic emphasis, should I say, for space engineers. You could go for tanking / healing, healing could be a mixture of that and a certain science ship. They're good on science ships, but they'll roll it out on engineering ships as well. And you can do a bit of DPS if you're in an escort or some kind of DPS ship, like a battle cruiser. So, everybody has their personal preferences, but given the orientation of the game, everyone would probably say DPS to say, well, if you do DPS, you blow them up first. Just because that's the case doesn't mean an engineer is useless. You will encounter opponents, particularly things like really difficult opponents, not so much a tactical cube anymore. Perhaps things like the Boar Queen or Vijas, perhaps, just to name a couple of examples, where you can easily do with an engineer healing you on the side, or perhaps even drawing an aggro from threat control, so they can draw the aggro away from the escorts as best they can, of course, and maybe if that doesn't work, heal the escorts in the meantime, so they actually survive something for a change. Now, you have a team of 5 in PvP. How many engineers would you like to be on it?
1.
1 or 2.
2.
No. Not you, Shadis.
2 to 3 tanks, science, engineer, well, 2 engineers. 2.
Okay. What if I said...
Can I say?
None.
Depends on the team setup. Yes, you can use 4-3, but best is at least 2 on each team.
You stole my thunder, damn it. But yeah, I was going to say, it depends how the team is set up. But generally, you will usually see 1 engineer on a pre-made team. Those tend to be a good tank aggros. They can be ignored because all the DPSs are focusing on somebody else, so like a science ship if necessary, and particularly DPS ships or like escorts. But just because that's the case, like I said, doesn't mean the engineer is useless. You can still heal them, and that's why I find it's usually a good idea to emphasize tanking and healing together, because tanks are generally the more ignored, since they never die with all their healing abilities. People will not target them, and therefore their entire power point is useless. And you can start healing, but don't lean too much into healing if you do go that strategy. And I say that because if you go too far into healing, you may not leave sufficient heals for your set for yourself. So if ever comes a time where you do face against multiple escorts or 1 high damage escort, you may find yourself dead, which is, suffice to say, not very handy in any PvP match. We'll cover more specific, like alternate things to do with an engineer in later times, but today we'll just be focusing on, well, essentially probably the more common of the engineers and what they're emphasizing, which will be tanking, and with a few elements of healing as well, since it's basically along the same lines. Now, there are a few ships out there which can easily heal. The ship I'm flying, for example, the Recluse Carrier, it's the Universal Commander. You can put an engineer in, and you can make an effective tank out of it, and many regard it as one of the best tanks there is in the game. You can put it in Odyssey, you can put it in a Galaxy, you can put it in basically any ship with an engineer that has kind of tanky role. Galore, that's more of a DPS ship, but you can easily tank with that as well.
Oh, you can.
Galore.
Galore.
Definitely on my list, I'd love to get one of those.
Got one.
Arr.
Alright.
But yeah, those are my initial recommendations if you do pursue that route. Now, granted personal preference here, but what would you guys say would be your personal preference for an engineer in some kind of tanking ship with perhaps a little bit of healing on the side of it to help your teammates out?
What would be my preference? What do you mean?
What kind of preference of what ship would you prefer to be in?
Oh, okay.
Sovereign.
I prefer to... Personally, I prefer to be in a Star Cruiser, but there's no one type of ship. It all depends on the player.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Sovereign's a little bit too tactical based. It has got a couple of heal.
I'd say from personal experience, despite being a tactical, I think everyone in the channel has known
what my galaxy is capable of.
Well, depends on the ship. The
Yeah.
buff depends on the buff layer. For example, with Fleet Ambassador, that's a versatile ship that has that can be half healer, half a tank. You know, because of the commander side and commander engineer and lieutenant engineer. Yeah. Then you have like an Odyssey who has a universal buff layers, which you can vary to create a full tank, a full healer, or balance it, half healer, half.
Well, for me, it would be equally a Sovereign class or a Refit Excelsior.
Yeah, I know for me, I like the Sovereign just for PvE because it has that little tactical. So I don't know. To me, it has that little more DPS or to kind of help out in PvP. I would like to probably go with something like the Odyssey, something with more survivability.
Same.
Mura nailed it back there as well. It entirely depends on what the player is doing.
Setup is
and the setup,
PvE or PvP.
the preferences, yeah, and basically what they're emphasizing. Tanking is a pretty universal thing for everyone, I have to say. It's engineers are a lot more focused on it simply because of their natural abilities and the way the ships are orientated, the cruisers. So you will find, granted it'll be easier for an engineer, you will find tanking pretty universal for everyone. An engineer does the best out of the three professions in tanking, and their ships reflect that. For the healing side, you can spread your wings a bit on that. Things like extend shields is a good engineering ability. It's external only, but it will reinforce the shields of an ally over the course of 30 seconds, provided you're within, I think it's 7.5 kilometers of their
6 or 7, something like that. Yeah. Also with that buff that reinforces your resistance to damage when using extend shields. I think they also stack, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we'll cover more DOF specializations in the later session as well, by the way. But yeah, tanking is universal, so don't entirely rule it out for an engineer in that specific case of saying, well, everyone wants a tank, an engineer's kind of useless. It's more focused there. So that's why I say, essentially, it's usually a good idea if you really want to pursue that route. I've mentioned it a few times already. Use a few heals for your teammate, because it's always very handy.
Cross heal, always.
Yeah,
for your team, yeah. Cross healing especially. Yeah, what that means is basically, usually about 2 engineers, they tend to heal each other if one of them is a target, or both of them heal the same target if it's under fire. So like a Defiant is under fire from multiple escorts, both the healers, the engineers, will use their heals on that Defiant, and it will basically never die.
What are you guys doing?
Basically, yeah, what we said about cross healings, how do I say this? Is basically when the whole team is healing each other. You will lots of pre-mates. That is basically their main how do I say, protocol when doing PvP, like TSI, Serpent, they always cross heal. Mostly because they're cross heal mostly because if you say heavily depend on one healer, you know, say we have 3 techs, 1 engineer in the reckless with a healer and 2 psi, you will come a lot of time into situation that smart teams and leaders of the enemy team will find that that certain team heavily depends on the that person. They will try, like I did plenty of times. We can say that how many times will I use my side, push you, try to be recruited and separate away from team. Then that team will come into situation no healing, and they become basically a dead meat for the escorts, you know.
Yeah, now, to emphasize cross healing, if you look at Killivan ship, Bradley, I'm going to throw a few heals on him. This one, hazard emitters, is probably one of the more common ones. This is both a self and a external heal. It's fantastic for clearing DOTs like plasma fires, and it's good, generally one of the best abilities for hull healing as well. You've got engineering transfer shield strength, oxygen, and of course EPS, which by the way is external at the same time, so you can pop it off on an escort if they need it rather than yourself. Now, self-healing abilities include, if you look at my ship, Tuning Fork, excellently named, and this is about Shields 3. I'd recommend for pretty much every ship with a Lieutenant Commander slot. That's just a personal preference. But Emergency Part of Shields 3 is, in my opinion, one of the best tanking and healing abilities there is. It's a self, so it takes away from the team, perhaps, but you gain so much shield power, so much resistance, and, well, it's just very good. Now, another one is a natural engineer ability, which is reverse shield polarity. It's rotate shield frequency, rather.
Warrior. Oh shit!
It's not as effective as Emergency Battle Shields, but it's good in combination with it.
No, tracker, he's meaning rotate shield frequency, not...
Yeah, I mispronounced that. And it's also good for serving a time while your Emergency Battle Shields are cycling, and while they're on, maybe, like I said. And of course, as I mentioned there, reverse shield polarity. Basically, it's you cannot kill me temporarily unless you are a Prometheus syndrome ship, in which case I will die of a whole bleed through. But this is basically shield immunity for this. Now, a good combination I've seen is tactical team and reverse shield polarity. You combine them and all of your shields will go up instantly.
Sweet.
Yeah. Because tactical team, its ability is to redistribute the shield facing which is under fire, and basically get that shield upwards because it's under fire the most. That ability is effectively nullified if you're under fire from multiple directions, by the way, as well. But in combination, of them, all your shields will go up. So tactical team will be one of your best tanking abilities at the same time. I know it's a tactical ability, but if you can fit it on a ship, at least one of them would do nicely. Then put it on, because you'll find your shield open a lot more than you think, even with the amount of shield heals you have. So tactical team will help counter that. Science teams, it's not as big. It's not as big of a deal, but it still can be pretty handy if you've maybe got the room. I don't rate it as highly as some other people, but it's up to you what you want to do. It's actually pretty nice shield heal rather if you get it up high enough in the ranks. But like I said, that entirely depends on the where you got the room or not.
Yeah, basically the science team is only considered a lifesaver against some nuke. That's it.
And all their science debuffs too, it says.
That's actually one thing to watch out for. Science abilities, particularly the sub-nuke, will be your mortal enemy. Tetrions are a mortal enemy of shield tanking, for example, and, well, basically everything is a mortal enemy of a hull tanker. So watch out for Tetrions, watch out for shield strippers, and watch out for sub-nukes. I know we're going to cover DOFs later on, but if there was only one DOF I was going to ever cover in this one so far, this first session, it would be the remove debuff DOF. Every time you hit, every time you hit an emergency power 2 ability. So it doesn't matter what emergency power 2 ability is, it doesn't have to be shields. You will remove the debuff, so at least there's a chance of it. The purple one is about a 40% chance.
Yep.
That's a lifesaver for any ship, particularly engineer. So if you can get that, it's fairly expensive, I think.
Purple one is about 9-10 million. Red, blue one is about less than 1 million. So blue one will also suffice.
Blue one will suffice. Any questions so far?
Nope.
Nope.
Okay, I've gone more into depth of hull healing, but not too much, and tanking. About a limited experience of that. Engineering teams, hazard emitters, polarized hull, oxysafe. Those will be your primary hull resistance abilities. Brace for impact as well, and the subsistence field modulator, just resist death. But like I said, it is somewhat limited. Your resistance is finite, whereas shield power, it has a limit, but you can continuously heal shields all the time. The resistance, you will still lose hull, even though you are at like 50% resistance or something. So I wouldn't recommend hull healing as much as anything else, but it still can be pretty handy. So watch out for things that unnecessary abilities that you that may be removed from your own tanking abilities. For example, Engineering Team 3, in my personal opinion, is a completely overrated ability because
Don't use it.
Because it removes the ability of most part of Shield 3. You can't put it on if you've got that on.
Yeah, if you have ability to put EPTS 3, put it always.
Yeah, but you will find rare situations where you do that. But unless you, of course, you want to have it on, in which case of that. Ox to Bat builds, by the way, if you're wondering, don't really work as an engineer healer because they remove your auxiliary power, and auxiliary powers and shield powers will be your highest power levels traditionally if you're a healer. You can put shield to 100, you can put auxiliary to 100, but both I'd recommend a 100 for the main and
roll.
a 70 for shields if you're a healer or a tank. That will help you significantly more, particularly that high auxiliary for healing and all of your tanky abilities. Any questions or comments on that so far?
Yeah, what about weapons configurations, as in all beams or all torpedoes, that type of thing?
That's a good question, actually. Weapons. If you're tanking and healing, in this specific case, you essentially won't be doing the DPS as you would expect. Now, that would therefore boil down to a logical preference of what is the most supportable beam array, or turret, or any type of other weapon. Usually beams gives you a good idea because they have a high proc rate. Turrets have a higher proc rate, but they do very little. It's up to you what you want to have. But what would be your guys' initial thoughts on probably the most supportable weapon energy type?
Phaser for me.
Disruptor.
Disruptor.
Okay. Why do you say that?
Depends. Disruptor for doing damage, phaser mostly for, I don't know,
Phaser for support.
Yep.
Okay, apart from another question, what weapon would you have the least satisfying response from a support weapon? What's the least supportable one?
Anti-proton.
Yep, because it's basically the only one that is not universal of the team. It's not like a debuff. The rest of them are. So it depends what you want. Phasers are good for knocking out subsystems. Disruptors are good for general improved damage because the enemy has low resistance and proc quite often anyway. Plasma is a general DOT, but you will find it uses quite a few. How about half the time, because the enemies will most of the time have hazard emitters on them as well. Tetrions, they can be pretty good, but that would entirely depend on you firing at the target in the first place, which will not be the case if you are a healer or a tanker. So their proc is somewhat limited but helpful, and the same is for Polaron. So that basically boils down to the most recommended ones I would choose would be Phaser or Disruptor. Disruptor for more damage for the entire team, which is always handy, and Phasers to knock out a random subsystem. And it's up to you whether to determine which one would be the more preferable for yourself and for the entire team. I'd recommend keeping maybe both if you can afford them on standby to see what would be the more preferable. Any other questions or comments? Okay, one final thing, console layouts. If you're a tanker healer, you'll probably want to go for more resistance and a general strength of your skill point abilities, like shield emitters. Consoles is good for improving your transfer shield strength and extend shields, for example. You could go for a SIF generator for improving hull repairs from hazard emitters and SIF. Or you could go for more self-resistance abilities like neutroniums and field generators. But I would probably keep at least maybe 2 neutroniums and maybe at least 1 field gen in any tanker or healer, because you don't want to deprive yourself too much.
Oh yeah, that's a minimum.
But of course that depends on what your setup is like. If you find yourself in the situation where, well, you don't really need them, go for it. Because then you can do more, possibly with different consoles. I always like to see variable builds. I always enjoy them. And final thing, universal consoles, debuffs on them, things like anti-matter spreads, AoEs, general things like that, isometric charges. Those are really good for supporting the team because while you're not directly firing at the target, you're debuffing them. And that can support the team at the same time, and all it requires is a click of a button. So I'd recommend something to help support the team if it was a general debuff from an AoE console.
What about the point defense phaser consoles?
That's another handy one as well. They can shoot down little fighters easy, and
Spam.
incoming torpedoes, just general spam. It's a good little console. It can be somewhat limited because it entirely depends on any fighters in the first place. But given nowadays, it's pretty much always the case in every match. That just about covers space.